Hello guys, Jam is here and welcome to another DashFight video. Today, we'll be taking a look at one of the fighting styles represented in Street Fighter. In its storied history, Street Fighter has featured over 120 characters, which is wild if you think about it. Of those 120, you can imagine how many fighting styles have been represented, from fundamental styles like Judo to more fantastical techniques like Ansatsuken, which Ryu and Ken use. But perhaps one of the most fascinating, to me at least, is a new one which came with one of the debutants of the game, JP. You've all seen JP. His drip, his graces, and his menace have all made him endearing, or infuriating, depending on what side of the screen you are on, to the players at least. But what in the world is his fighting style? It's certainly not any karate I have seen. JP fights with a stylish walking stick with one arm placed behind his back. Watching his moves and specials, one might be tempted to claim that JP uses a purely invented fighting style, but you'd only be half right, because while his style using psycho power is non-existent in the world we live in today, his normals and even grabs are completely grounded in real martial arts. The name of the style JP practices is a fighting discipline called Bartitsu. Bartitsu was made prominent by none other than Arthur Conan Doyle, the writer and creator of the Sherlock Holmes series. In The Adventure of the Empty House, a story in which Sherlock, who was thought to be dead, came back to life. He attributed his survival to the knowledge of a fighting style known as Bartitsu. This was an error by Doyle, and it kind of picked up from there. Bartitsu gained prominence between 1898 and 1902 before facing an inevitable decline and finally fading into obscurity. It is a fighting style that fuses traditional boxing with French savate, jiu-jitsu, and cane fighting. This eclectic style was developed by an Englishman by the name of Edward William Barton Wright. Barton Wright had traveled to Japan to work as a railway engineer, and while there, he studied jiu-jitsu under two masters. The first being Sensei Terajino Kunichiro, who had taught him in the ways of Shinden Fudo Ryu style of jiu-jitsu, and his second master was rumored to be Kano Jigoro, under whom he'd learned Kodokan Jiu-Jitsu. From the name of the fighting style, you can already see that Barton Wright was heavily influenced by jiu-jitsu. The name Bartitsu is derived from an amalgamation of Barton's own name and jiu-jitsu. He also studied other styles, and when he came back to England in 1898, he decided to open a school called the Bartitsu Club, where he would be training individuals in the noble art of his new fighting style. Acquiring the services of various masters, including the legendary Yukio Tani, Barton Wright soon had a section of the British public enraptured with this so-called defense against every sort of attack. You could say that the brief popularity of Bartitsu was due to a number of factors, which made this total self-defense appealing to the people of the time. The first factor was the spate of crime that had hit England in the early 1900s. It wasn't uncommon for a gentleman to find himself up against a mugger. Therefore, knowing some sort of self-defense to tackle the enemy was necessary. Bartitsu was appealing as it was a fighting style that made use of some of the common accessories that a man or woman might have on their person, like a cane, umbrella, cloak, and so on. With these, the assailant would have to think twice about attacking. The second major factor was an obsession with all things Japan that existed in most of Western Europe and America at the time. Japan was famously closed off from a large section of the world for over 200 years, and only opened up in 1854 after Commodore Matthew Perry and the Black Ships from the United States forced Japan into a trade agreement, which gave the West access to Japanese exports for the first time. Over the next century or so, there was a clamor for all things from Japan. You could argue that this demand still exists today, but it was at a fever pitch back then. One of Japan's famous exports was martial arts. So, when Bartitsu came as a mixture of Japanese jiu-jitsu and more traditional martial arts like boxing, it immediately grabbed the attention of the public. Another major point was a growing interest in something called physical culture. This was a movement that encouraged sporting activity within the populace, and as the years following the Industrial Revolution had seen a decline in physical health, as more and more jobs occupied by middle and upper class were sedentary in nature. So, just as we all like to hit the gym nowadays, so also there was a greater appreciation for sports as a means to keep fit while looking graceful. Sports like rugby and cricket started to gain popularity among some of the upper class. So, a fighting style that was centered around the middle to upper class was always going to be popular. Traditionally, Bartitsu usually incorporates boxing and savate for the striking range, grappling for the close-range combat, and the cane for a farther distance, or even a projectile range. With JP, we see that while he uses some of the Bartitsu moves, he isn't completely wedded to the style. So how are we to define how JP fights? Well, the simple answer is that JP uses a mix of Bartitsu and Psycho Power to fight. A lot of his normals are inspired by Bartitsu, including his light, medium, and heavy punches. For the light punch, he uses his stick to hit the opponent. It is similar to the cane jab in Bartitsu, but not a perfect replication. For his medium and heavy punches, they are a lot more recognizable to Bartitsu practitioners. His medium punch is a thrust which he performs by twisting his wrist to generate power and hit the opponent with the tip of his cane. For the heavy punch, he swings at the opponent in a move called a cut, which inflicts damage on the opponent. These cane fighting methods are all staples of Bartitsu. His kicks are also borrowed from French savate, especially his medium kick and forward medium kick, which are very strong kicks from the savate discipline. JP does not fight as a grappler, but his throws embody everything about Bartitsu. Bartitsu seeks to use the opponent's strength against them, as it anticipates that the person using it is likely smaller or not as strong. This is because as a self-defense technique, Bartitsu was aimed at not just men of the upper class who might not be as strong as lower income individuals, but also to women who might be accosted by rogue men. So, a lot of Bartitsu's techniques aim to destabilize the opponent by hitting weak points including the knees, shin, wrist, and head. A quick look at JP's forward and backward throw shows this as he uses his stick to extend the opponent's knee, unbalancing them. Then he twists their arm and uses his stick to jab at the chest. His back throw uses most of the same technique, but this time he flips the opponent over with his arm. This uses the opponent's momentum against them, causing a knockdown. It helps that JP is jacked, and this enables him to pull off some of these moves more conveniently. But it is very clear that his dominant hand, which he hides behind his back, is where all the fun stuff happens. He uses this hand to perform his psycho-powered moves. You might notice that this hand is the most important thing to him in combat because of how he conceals it. In Bartitsu, practitioners are advised to hold back their cane or stick while leading with a fist. This is to avoid an opponent hitting the stick out of the fighter's hand. However, JP leads with his stick hand, showing that he isn't as worried about losing that weapon since he can just use his psycho power to defeat an opponent. It also gives JP another option with which to fight against repeat opponents. This is because one of the major drawbacks to Bartitsu is since it relies on the element of surprise, it isn't the best for repeat opponents. Therefore, for someone like JP, having psycho power to use while also retaining skills from Bartitsu, he can ensure that he has the upper hand, even if it's against an opponent he has faced before. As for defensive moves, well, Bartitsu uses a cloak to distract the opponent, but JP has no moves in which he utilizes his cloak. It'll be interesting if he develops a new move in a patch where he can use his cloak. The other defensive move is using a hat to defend against an attack. JP doesn't have a hat in his costume 1, but he does have one with his costume 2, but he doesn't use that either. This could point to JP's deep-seated arrogance at his strength and ability. It, of course, helps that he can use his psycho power while doing a drive reversal or his parry counter. Apart from the Sherlock Holmes movie where Robert Downey Jr. used a form of Bartitsu against some assailants, this technique has also shown up in anime, with Tanaka from Black Butler and Mokichi Robertson from Kengan Ashura made to be Bartitsu practitioners. Bartitsu fits JP to the T and is the perfect style for him, and if that doesn't work, he can always unleash his psycho power, which will be more than enough for most adversaries. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video. We'll be looking at other fighting styles in Street Fighter and how they correlate with the character. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and until the next one, take care of yourselves.